Started. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke Media briefing on the aftermath of the 2020 election. I'm Greg Phillips with Duke Communications. After the storming of the Capitol building last week, America is on a knife edge as the Trump presidency moves into the final week before Joe Biden's inauguration. We have three Duke scholars with us today, a historian, a political scientist, and a legal scholar, to discuss this extraordinary moment in American history and where we go from here. I'll introduce our speakers and get the discussion started, then we'll open it up to questions. With us today is Darrell Miller. He is a law professor who specializes in civil rights, constitutional law, civil procedure, and state and local government law at Duke, where he also co-directs the Center for Firearms Law. His scholarship on the Second Amendment has been cited by the US Supreme Court. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Also joining us is Adrian Lent-Smith. She is Associate Professor and Associate Chair in Duke's Department of History, where she teaches courses on the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives, and Modern America. She's also working on a book about police violence during the twilight of the Civil Rights era. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And we have Alexander Kirshner. He is an Associate Professor of Political Science at Duke, where his expertise includes anti-democratic opposition to democratic government, democratic revolutions, and the value of loyal opposition. He is the author of the book, A Theory of Militant Democracy, The Ethics of Combating Political Extremism. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Okay, so we'll jump right in here. Professor Miller, I'd like to start with you. The police response to last week's storming of the Capitol was clearly inadequate, but what was most striking to you about how law enforcement reacted to that riot?
It's an excellent question. I think two or three things come to mind. The one is, as you said, it was a catastrophic failure of security to actually have the Capitol breached by rioters. Notwithstanding the fact that you had individual instances of undoubted heroism, like the African-American officer who led the mob away from the Senate while it was unsecured. Still, it was a catastrophic failure of security of the very seat of democracy. A couple of things come to mind about what transpired there. The first is that I think we are all very fortunate. It's becoming apparent by the day that the potential for loss of life was catastrophic, that there was a plan in place, that people had come prepared to try to hijack democracy in the Capitol building. And that if more people had come with firearms, that it really would have been a bloodbath. So the fact that there are, by most accounts, 5 fatalities is remarkable given the level of violence and the unprecedented failure of security of the Capitol building at this time. The second thing that comes to mind is just the asymmetry with respect to how the reaction and response to Black Lives Matter protests occurred during this past spring and summer, as opposed to what occurred here in the Capitol building. I'm just amazed to think that you can have a scenario in which there are flashbangs and tear gas and all kinds of force used on what was mostly peaceful protests in DC. And then here you can actually have a largely, but not exclusively white mob actually storm the Capitol building, take up a seat at the speaker's chair. And then there's video of them being escorted out, not even escorted, basically led out of the building with the doors held for them by the very police officers that they had just overcome with force. So it's hard for me to really get my head around these two images, one of a peaceful protest being cleared for a photo op, and the other of rioters being shown out the door and have the door held for them by the police.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I've certainly got a lot of follow-up questions on that. But for now, we will move on to Professor Lent Smith. This country obviously has a long history of protests, from peaceful civil disobedience up to all-out violence. In the aftermath, you called last week's riot a flabbergasting reality. How much of a threat is that reality, do you think, to American democracy at this point?
Well, Greg, I think it is a threat, right? Anytime you have a mob willing to overpower and injure people to get inside of the Capitol to overwhelm and harm congressional representatives, like, American democracy has a problem. And the fact that parts of those mobs were the very people whose job it is to represent or to uphold that democracy is incredibly worrying. I think historians of the US South, or of the US broadly speaking, have a great deal to say right now, in part because we've seen echoes of this, if you can see an echo. We've seen precursors of this in our academic work, even if at least I am flabbergasted to see the escalation in this contemporary moment. To my mind, I think back to the Wilmington coup of 1898, in which a mob overthrew a democratically elected municipal government in coastal North Carolina and installed a government their own government that had run on the white supremacy campaigns of the 1890s. I think of mobs during the desegregation era who were willing to attack and threaten school children in their rage at Supreme Court rulings. I think of spectacle lynchings over and over again, the big kind of mass lynchings that had a carnival atmosphere in which people, recited psalms, sang patriotic songs, sold lemonade, right? Good, respectable city leaders and townsfolk. All of which is to say that, as I said, this is an escalation of things that we've seen in the past. It's not a departure of past patterns or from past patterns, but it's important to keep in mind that in that past, these things didn't just threaten American democracy, they harmed it, they hampered it, they threatened to break it. And inaction on the part of local government or on the federal government was taken as approval and encouragement. They sent a message, broadly speaking. So one of the things that we have to figure out now is what we are willing to do to preserve our democracy, to fix the things that are broken, and ask ourselves what message we wish to convey to each other and to the world that's watching.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I've also got lots of follow-ups for you on that, but for now, we'll go over to Professor Kirshner. As we all know, there's an ongoing effort in Congress right now to impeach President Trump. But you'd written even before last week's riot that he also needs to be disqualified from running again. Why is that? How can it happen? And how would that not be undemocratic?
So thanks very much. So there are two ways that a president or an office holder can be disqualified from future office under the US Constitution. I mean, potentially there are more, but there are two kind of prominent ways. The most prominent, and the one that we're seeing the most debate about now, is via impeachment. So if the House impeaches and the Senate convicts with a 2/3 majority, the Senate could then vote via simple majority to bar the president from office. And when we wrote, I guess 6 weeks ago or something like that, that the president's actions warranted that or warranted some kind of exclusion from office, that is the mechanism we were thinking of. Since we also considered a second path, which has been all over the newspapers in recent days, which is via Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And that bars certain individuals who take part in insurrection or rebellion from holding federal or state office. And the 14th Amendment was passed in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it imagined specifically office holders who had participated in the Confederacy and in the effort to overthrow the federal government. And so quite a few scholars believe that the president's actions on the 6th arguably fall within the actions that are kind of imagined by the third section of the 14th Amendment. What's interesting is there's a lot of debate, I think, amongst legal scholars about precisely how this mechanism would work, whether Congress could pass via simple majorities legislation that then President Biden could sign, which would block President Trump from seeking office, whether they would have to pass, whether Congress would have to pass some kind of legislation, which then could, then prosecutors or perhaps could pursue President Trump via the courts. I think it's quite up for debate. And ultimately, I imagine, although I would defer to Professor Miller here, that this is the kind of thing that would end up in the Supreme Court, where the court itself, and likely Justice Kavanaugh, would have a significant part in saying exactly how Section 3 of the 14th Amendment would apply in these cases. So those are the two kind of prominent ways that somebody like President Trump could be disqualified from seeking future office. So why isn't it democratic or undemocratic to do that? The first is because the right to vote requires a reasonable but not unlimited set of options when you're choosing. So citizens don't have the right to violate the rights of others, right? That's why we have a constitution. And citizens don't have the right to elect whomever they want. We typically have a limited set of choices, as we did in this election when we vote, and we don't have the right to elect a child or a foreigner to the presidency, for example, and that's completely consistent with why we think voting is valuable in the first place. So our rights to participate in a democracy just aren't set back if we can't elect people who have worked to undermine the electoral process. So if we think about why it's important that we have a right to vote, those interests are not set back if we can't elect people who are seeking to undermine those very interests. So that's one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that people don't have the right to seek office. They have a right not to be excluded invidiously, let's say because of their race, from seeking office. But I don't have the right to office just because I want it. So people who have used their power to undermine the electoral process, which I think it's quite clear that the president has, have demonstrated that they won't exercise power well. They won't exercise that power in the interest of their citizens and in the interest of the political system as a whole. And because of that, via their actions, they've relinquished any legitimate complaint that they might have about being kept or excluded from political office. So in a case like this, where you have a figure like the president, who I think quite clearly has taken actions that were intended to undermine the democratic process, it looks like neither the people themselves, like neither the citizens would have their interests set back if he's excluded from the political process, and the president himself wouldn't have any legitimate complaint about why he was being excluded. And that's why I think that it isn't undemocratic to take action like this.
Sure, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our panelists for those opening answers. Certainly there's a lot more than we can get our arms around in 1 hour, but we are going to tackle as much of this as we can. And in the interest of that, we'll open it up to questions now. If you're in Zoom, you can type a question into the Q&A window and I can ask it. Or if you'd like to ask your question in person, you can raise your hand in Zoom so we can unmute you and ask a question that way. If you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. For now, we've got some questions already, and so I'm going to go through those. And Professor Lent Smith, I'd like to come back to you, and certainly other panelists feel free to weigh in on these as well. Professor Miller talked about the failings in the policing of the riot last week. To what extent do you think it's possible that, despite there were some institutional failures, it seems like that perhaps the American establishment is not set up to see white conservatives as a threat? And could you talk a little bit about, how we've seen authorities respond to violence in the past, and whether you think that's possibly a factor in what happened last week in terms of the inadequate response?
Yeah. I was struck by Professor Miller using the word catastrophic and catastrophe a couple of times. I think it was the right word. It's very apt. The police were caught flat-footed in a way that makes no sense, given the reports we've seen in recent days that the FBI knew that there was trouble coming, right? That the Capitol Police who said that their superiors left them inadequately prepared for things. It's become in the past days, almost pro forma, but I think because it's correct to say that if these had been Black or brown people, what we would have seen would have been seriously, remarkably different. And people are citing the summer protests, the response to the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests as the counterexample in which, damage to property was seen as sort of equivalent to or sort of beyond the harm of damage to life. What I think we're seeing, one of the explanations for the sort of catastrophic failure, is that many authorities work on racial scripts, and those scripts have been produced and intensified over time. I mentioned the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, in which the evocation of Black men as the Black incubus, right? Black men as rapists was used as a way to delegitimize their participation in electoral politics, was used to reinforce the validity of disfranchisement, right? And that's one example, but it's an example, or it's a sort of strategy that's been repeated over and over and over again. So we see these linkings together of Blackness and criminality, of brownness and illegality, of Muslim as threat. And I think what we are living with then is that some authorities are so quick to see what's not there, to make those links, that they overlook what is there. On some level, you quoted me calling this flabbergasting. On some level, I am still stupefied by the fact that a right-wing militia threatened to kidnap the governor of Michigan. And that didn't signal that we had a problem with political violence in relation to Trumpism that needed serious addressing. Or there was a suicide bomber in Nashville on Christmas Day who is not discussed in the way that he would be discussed, or to the extent that he would be discussed, were he African American or were he Muslim, right? We're historically have shorthanded our understandings of people, of danger, of national security, of domestic security around race in ways that hamper our ability to assess and address true problems.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And for those of you who were on the briefing last week, you may remember David Shanzer here at Duke, who studies terrorism and had talked about the rise of white nationalist terrorism in this country and how it hasn't always been given the attention it deserved. And related to that, Professor Miller, we've seen a lot of calls since last Thursday, on social media, calls amongst the people aligned with those who rioted last week for more violence at state capitals and elsewhere. When we look at this police response, obviously there will be inquiries, there have already been resignations and firings, but a kind of a response and analysis of that takes time. Given that there's the potential for violence in the next week, do you have any sense institutionally for how law enforcement might respond, in the sense of could there be a knee-jerk reaction in them going so far the other way because they felt there were inadequacies, or do maybe some of these attitudes potentially that may have hampered the response last week continue to hold sway in states across the nation where people either are not anticipating violence, or even maybe because they're philosophically aligned with it, are not going to treat it with the seriousness it deserves?
Well, there's a lot in that question to unpack. And so let me try to take it piece by piece. So the first is that you're absolutely correct. At least according to reports, there is threats of more violence, of more armed protests, of more attempts to cow or intimidate the elected arms of government, apparently for sort of Trump-related ends. And that's very, very worrisome. I have seen steadily, especially among right-wing political actors, the normalization of armed protests, sometimes in opposition to government and sometimes in at least professed solidarity with them. But the images are hard to erase, which is heavily armed individuals, almost always white individuals, milling about state houses, as the other panelist, Professor Lent had mentioned, threatening to kidnap a sitting governor of the United States in Michigan. So the threats are real. As far as the reaction, it's hard to tell. I just saw this morning, for example, that there are National Guard members, sleeping, resting within the Capitol building, a sight that I just never thought in my time I'd ever see. It is something that it's a familiar sight, when I would look at news reports from fragile democracies nationwide, but I never thought that it would be a sight I would see in my own nation. Now, to the extent that that is a reaction, maybe not an overreaction, but a reaction to the threat posed in the next few days, and on the 20th, when there's the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden, that seems commensurate with the threat. I am worried that as tensions rise, that there could be more violence. And for the simple reason that when people begin to show up to protests with firearms, and they are met with similarly armed security forces, police, National Guard, it's not that hard to imagine things going awry very, very quickly, and not by accident. I can't believe that people have been taking fireworks, for example, to these protests because any indication would be that that could be mistaken very, very quickly for gunfire, leading to mass bloodshed, much less bringing actual firearms in an incredibly tense atmosphere. So I am hoping that people will protest peacefully. I am hoping that the police forces will respond appropriately and not overreact. But we have somehow backed ourselves into this scenario where it is perfectly normal in some parts of the country for people to show up at mass protests with firearms. And it's only been by sheer luck that we haven't seen a huge massacre occur over a mistaken understanding about where somebody's pointing a gun or why or how or what that sound was, or one of a number of things that could lead very, very precipitously to tragedy.
Yes, indeed. A very stark reality we're in at the moment, for sure. And related to that, Professor Kirshner, understandably, we're all focused at the moment on what the next week may bring and hoping that there won't be violence. But beyond that, presumably, and of course it is an assumption at this point, that we get President Biden inaugurated and things move ahead. What does all this violent polarization right now mean for the future of legitimate democratic opposition in this country? We still have a system that is based on open disagreement. But right now, that's very much in chaos because of this violent spasm. What do you think that this political moment means for the future of democracy and democratic opposition in this country?
Well, I mean, I wish I could tell you that based on my reading of the moment, that what was going to happen in 6 months or a year was completely obvious, but that wouldn't be true. I mean, ideally, what would happen is that the president's actions and the outcome of it, and the fact that there are soldiers in the Capitol, would force the leaders, I suppose, within the Republican Party to acknowledge the importance of kind of the very basic elements of loyal opposition and of legitimate opposition, that you accept an electoral outcome. Right? That would be, that is the best case scenario, is that a significant, if not leading group of people within the party would realize, and there would be some kind of sea change such that they would embrace this practice, which we have seen come under assault. That would ideally contribute to limiting the polarization that we see. That matters because when things are polarized, if a party I disagree with takes power and I see that as being a threat to my fundamental well-being, and the more that happens, the less likely I am to accept that outcome. That's just why polarization is dangerous. An alternative view, a more pessimistic view, or a more pessimistic concern would be that nothing much has changed by this sequence of events, and that whatever is causing or driving the polarization in this country, which is also occurring in other countries as well, will not relent. And that rather than this being a kind of moment that we're all going to wake up from and see what's going on, in fact, this is just one more step on an increasingly dangerous path. And I think here it's worth acknowledging what Professor Lent Smith said about the fact that what we observed at the Capitol in the last few days is not completely detached from what we saw earlier this year at the Michigan Capitol and at the Pennsylvania Capitol. And so it's not discontinuous from those things, and it is quite worrisome.
Thank you.
Can I jump in with a thought
Please.
that is a little muddled? As I've been trying to think about my discomfort with the word polarization, which I think does not capture what is happening or what has happened. And I think, to link it back to kind of earlier observations, that polarization kind of insinuates a kind of equal and opposite responsibility for alienation. And actually, if we think about our go-to examples for what might happen next, I'm thinking about, sort of post-Civil War, the end of Reconstruction, or Nixon resigning. Those two examples tell us that attempts at reconciliation without doing serious repair work and without like a reckoning with who's responsible for what are likely to create more dysfunction. So one of the questions, again, what's going to happen next is still an open question. What needs to happen if we are going to get to a new more productive, less dysfunctional place in our politics is a serious reckoning with how these past moments came to pass, or these recent moments came to pass, and the culpability for the people who encouraged, incited, or enabled an incredibly dysfunctional politics. And I don't think that every party involved bears equal responsibility.
Sure, thank you for that additional context. And Professor Lent Smith, I'd like to stay with you here because as we look at the riots from last week, and this obviously forms part of an opposition to an incoming Biden administration, but clearly, there were extremist elements. One might say that the whole movement itself last week was extremist. But how important is it to identify and name the ideologies that were part of this riot, and what are some of the symbols that we saw used by the rioters? Tell us about what they actually represent.
Well, I mean, one of the most immediately striking is the Confederate flag, right? Moving through the halls of the Capitol. I think it's important to talk about the ideologies. It's important to think about the ways in which Confederate nostalgia feeds, but might also depart from a more sort of like neo-Nazi or contemporary embrace of fascism, right? Because those are not quite the same thing. I think the importance in seeing, naming, and analyzing lies in making sure that we don't treat individual things as one-offs that people will later look back and see a pattern to, right? So someone is going to write a book about this moment that someday that takes us from Oklahoma City, through Eric Rudolph, through the kind of, the small group, but powerful and terrifying subset of policemen who are entangled with paramilitary and right-wing militia stuff, and forward to the 20 teens and to now, right? And in order to really understand those linkages, in order to understand how they have fed and distorted our contemporary politics so that we don't even know what we mean when we talk about right-wing, and we don't actually mean conservative when we call this a conservative movement, right? We need to understand the players involved and what histories they think they're mobilizing, or what historical narratives they think they're working with when they feel authorized to do the kind of destruction that they're doing.
Sure, thank you. And Professor Miller, related to that, we've had a question come up that I'd like to address to you. And Professor Lent Smith was talking about the people involved and in the riot last week, and we know from reports that there are some, even if isolated, members of law enforcement from around the country that were involved in this. And the question we've had is, what, if anything, can and should be done to address white nationalism in law enforcement and the military? Because it does seem that there is a thread there, even if it's not dominant. How do you think that as a society we go about tackling that? Is it simply kind of rooting out individual people, or is there just more of a philosophical problem that's got to be addressed there, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's been a simmering issue, I think. I remember reading articles 20 years ago, 15 years ago, about this sort of thread of white nationalism, white supremacy in the military and in police forces. Going back to the Oklahoma City bombing and McVeigh, and even more recently with a Wilmington police officer who was fired for saying really egregiously racist and violent things on a hot mic that was recorded. So it's an issue, and it's one that needs to be addressed. And I really think it's really up to police departments and the military to sort of get their house in order, because it's a serious threat, right? Because policing and national defense has a kind of small d democratic function. The idea is, right, the equal, enforcement of the law sort of requires that all the actual people that are enforcing the law do so as best they can on an even-handed basis. that both the idea of who you enforce the law against and who you cut a break to should not be determined by sort of politics or by racial ideology. This is the whole reason why we have a professionalized police force. This is the whole reason why we have a system of national defense that is premised not on sort of activated of private militias, but on essentially what is a standing army, is that they have democratic commitments to equal justice, to the Constitution, to even-handedness that everybody will agree is not always actually deployed or shown in practice, but that is the spirit of the idea about why you have these sectors of society. And if they are being corrupted from within, if they are being taken over by persons that have ideologies or motivations that are not about small d democracy, not about equal representation, not about equal protection, then it's really incumbent and necessary upon those actors like the military and police departments to screen out and root out that issue. Otherwise, it will fester. It will fester, and it will lead to widespread distrust and increasing distrust of the very idea that we have a neutral law enforcement and neutral national security apparatus at all.
Sure, thank you very much. We have a raised hand in the audience, and so we're going to go ahead and unmute you. You're unmuted, so please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, this is Sam Dunkla. I'm a reporter in Pennsylvania. I'm just asking the folks a quick question. Given what we've seen, we're trying to report on the political trend that this could lead to in the Republican Party. For any of the panelists, given what we've seen, the Republican Party sort of adhering in part to a lot of the false election rumors that helped kind of stoke the environment for what we saw at the Capitol later this week. I mean, what, in your opinion, does this portend for a lot of their political futures?
I mean, historians are always hesitant to predict things. We like to look backwards and say, I told you so, rather than to look forward and say maybe. But what I will say is, if you look at the 1960s, right, if you remember that moment when LBJ knew that the sort of pushing civil rights legislation would lose him the white supremacists who'd made the Democratic Party their home for so many decades, the Republican Party, many people in the Republican Party made a gamble that they could incorporate disaffected segregationists and have them as constituents while still having control of the party's agenda. That worked better in some places than in others. What we've seen over the last several years is the increase, not just mobilizing power, but power and influence of a strain of racial nationalism that's not, the Republican Party's alone to own, but is large and powerful and vocal in the Republican Party. And those who cynically thought they could use it have lost control of it. So the question that they have to ask themselves now is, how do they get their party back, and who are they without it? Good luck to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just add, what comes to mind about the Republican Party is they're coming face to face with that great quote from Yeats about, we've fed our hearts on fantasy and our hearts have grown brute with the fair. I mean, this is what has happened is you've got a subsection of the Republican Party that has catered to the absolute worst kind of conspiracy mongering of some of their constituents, and rather than acting as a break, a voice of reason, they have come to embrace and speak with a mainstream things that are that 20 years ago would have been thought totally unreasonable. And I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know how you can have a two-party system like we do when a substantial portion of one party is simply not trafficking in fact anymore. They're just simply resistant to the basis of what the world is. I'm not, a sophisticated enough political scientist. I'm not a political scientist at all. I'm a law professor, but to know how you extract yourself from that, where you have, a sizable portion of one party that both isn't trafficking in the same kinds of factual world that the rest of the world is, the rest of the political world is. And two, because of that, has decided that it will see any result of any political process that does not confirm their preferred outcome as illegitimate. I just don't know how that's sustainable.
Can I just respond? I mean, I think the Pennsylvania case is interesting, right? You're going to have a new set of elections in 2 years. Pat Toomey is retiring. And if, for example, the Democrats are able to take that seat in an off-year election because members of the Pennsylvania Republican Party are seen as too extreme, or they nominate somebody who's too extreme. And we see an outcome somewhat like in Georgia that people take as somewhat surprising, as a loss for this way of proceeding. Then I think you will see people who are self-interested and want to be reelected, willing to change their tune. Probably the best news that we've had for democracy in the past several weeks is the election outcome in Georgia, and that's not a partisan issue because the Democrats won. Even if I may think that, it's because it's clear that at least in the Senate, the leadership of the Senate, in particular Mitch McConnell and people like him, have taken that as a message about the usefulness of an ideology that completely rejects the validity of the other party. When, for instance, Donald Trump isn't on the ballot. And the fact that those two senators, Republican senators, lost in Georgia when they were already holding a seat, and when I think I would have bet a large amount of money that they were going to win, is an incredibly good thing from the perspective of democracy, because it says, look, this is a strategy that might not prove useful. And the best we can hope for, I think, is that we see other election outcomes like that. That's not and it could be that you see Republicans, that what I'm saying, it's not about partisanship, but if we see Republicans who do acknowledge the legitimacy of their opponents be successful, if we see leaders running for office who do that, who are successful, that will be the best kind of news that we can get. Short of that, if it's the case that politicians in Pennsylvania and elsewhere think that their electoral fortunes will be advanced by rejecting the legitimacy of opposition, then as Professor Miller noted, we have huge problems for our political system. Because if only one party is willing to acknowledge the victories of their opponents, then that party itself will have an interest in shifting its own position. And then we're in serious trouble.
I think the other way that the Georgia example is a good one for, a promising or potential road for for a functional democracy is that, I mean, as we well know, Georgia didn't just happen, right? The electoral outcome in Georgia last week was a product of an organizing strategy and an organizing tradition that has been in place since Ella Baker got people mobilized, like via SNCC and elsewhere in the civil rights movement. And her vision was not about partisan politics. It was about getting everyday people to understand their capacity to make or affect transformational change. And you get enough everyday people who believe that they can do something, and you get a rich and capacious and expansive practice. And that as an alternative to overwhelming the national legislature and smearing feces on the walls seems to me like the route we'd rather choose.
For sure. Thank you, panelists, for that. And Sam, I hope that answers your question. A lot of good stuff in there. And I want to try and pull some of these threads together here, because Professor Lent Smith, as you just hinted, we've got two sides of a politically engaged coin. You know, this country has long had a lot of political apathy, but we saw what happened in Georgia, and then we saw what happened last week at the Capitol, and both came about as a result of a lot of passion kind of on both sides. And what we've seen here, you know, there's been a lot of talk here about, Professor Miller said, about kind of one side not engaging in facts. And just to be clear to everybody that's listening, you know, there are millions of people out there who believe the election was stolen, but 60 plus lawsuits, some of which were heard by Trump appointee judges, found absolutely no merit, no evidence whatsoever. But I come back to that because, Professor Kirshner, I wonder if you could tackle this. You mentioned, you know, some elements of hope here in that perhaps, you know, people are turning away from a kind of post-factual ideology, but we still do have millions of people for whom the facts and all of the court considerations of a stolen election went nowhere, and yet, you know, those things have still taken hold. So are you optimistic that there won't be enough politicians who will still look to mobilize those millions and millions of people and put facts aside and be willing to do that? Because at the risk of sounding hyperbolic, it seems like that's something that can send a democracy into a death spiral when there are leaders beyond President Trump who are willing to say, okay, I'm going to hitch my wagon to something that isn't based in fact. Like, where does that take us? I guess there was a question in there. I'm sorry, it was kind of convoluted.
Yeah, I mean, so people have believed in crazy things for a long time, right? I mean, I'm sure we could ask Professor Lent Smith to give us a lecture that could last as long as we wanted to listen about the wild things that many people in the United States have believed throughout its history. That being said, I think your question illustrates the fundamental importance of political leadership and of political acculturation, where now we have a president, the leader of a political party, not a fringe member of the party, and not even somebody important, but who doesn't play a fundamental role, but the leader of the party, saying that the sky isn't blue, but that it's pink, and everybody's saying, going along with that. And I think the import of that cannot be understated. And so the big question, I suppose, that we'll have is what happens post-Trump, whether the other people who are career politicians who might rise to take his place are as willing to engage in that kind of politics. I have to say for myself, it is one of Donald Trump's superpowers that he is able to speak about things that are not true as if they were true and seem impervious to any of the normal emotions that would go along with that. And it's not clear to me that another political actor will be able to do the same thing. We're going to see. Of course, it's also the case that like a much fuller answer to your question would talk about the media superstructure around all of these things. But nonetheless, I think what we've seen over the last 4 years, and in particular over the last 3 months, is just how important a role political leadership plays in these kinds of moments.
Can I just weigh in here and one quick comment, which is, I mean, it's too late now, obviously, but I have been in communication with my colleagues here about this extraordinary case that was filed by the AGs in the state of Texas against Pennsylvania, and I believe it was also Wisconsin. But alleging much of the kinds of things that has taken root about the 2020 election, and I think this was a huge missed opportunity. If the Supreme Court, who doesn't really have any dog in the fight, there's no political upside or downside for them to do anything. If they would have said with one voice, there has been no fraud. The election was conducted according to constitutional law and state law, and had actually reached the merits. That would have done at least some good for giving a structure for those Republicans who had sort of fed the kind of let's just see how it plays out narrative, to say, all right, now it has played out, right? And so anybody who keeps trying to say now that the Chief Justice is compromised, or the entire 9-member of the Supreme Court, they're all communist plants or something like that, those people are really not speaking rationally anymore. That would have given them a structure to do that. The Supreme Court would have been able to say there was no fraud. There is no fraud. There is no constitutional problem with how the election was handled. And that would have given a lot of the GOP some cover. The fact that they simply didn't pick up on the case at all and decided to simply dismiss it on a procedural posture is in accordance with what we sometimes refer to as the passive virtues of the judiciary, but really allowed people to read into what happened, what they will. And it did not give the GOP an out for those that say, let's let the legal process play itself out, because there was always, well, they never reached the merits. There was all this fraud that the justices didn't reach, and that has and it didn't give the political branches a chance to basically extricate themselves from the narrative of conspiracy that they had been playing along with in a kind of wink and nod way, all the way up until when the Capitol was stormed.
Professor Miller, thank you for that additional context. And another question somewhat related to that I'd like to get all of your perspectives on. Professor Lent Smith, you mentioned earlier about how in the civil rights era, the Democrats had to face up to the fact that white nationalists had been aligned with that party for so long. And obviously we've seen transformations over the years between the political parties. What do you all think are the chances right now that this kind of post-factual faction, if you like, of the Republican Party, has the potential to create a schism where the Republican Party either doesn't survive, or there's potentially a third party, or that there's a deep enough split there that we end up with a fundamental change to the kind of two-party system that we've had for so long in this country? Anybody would like to weigh in on that?
I mean, I'm extremely doubtful that will happen. After in 2008, when Obama won by a significant margin and Democrats took a 60-vote majority in the Senate, there was all sorts of things written about how the Republican Party was going to change fundamentally, and that there was going to be all these changes that would happen. And they had a very successful election in 2010, and not much changed at all. And so I think that rather than there being a kind of fundamental break, as I said, I think the most we can hope for is a kind of electoral message that the strategies that they have employed over the last, let's say, 5 years under the leadership of Donald Trump will not be successful without him. And that, I think, could lead to a change in the strategies that the party employs. For me, that is the kind of most likely or most optimistic scenario about what could happen. I think the idea that the party is going to fracture or that it's going to face some grand denouement is wrong.
I mean, it also bears saying that likely and possible are different things. And it's good to remember that we haven't always had the Democratic Party or the Democratic Party and the Republican Party as our main parties or our only parties. Our politics have evolved before. They've incorporated stronger third parties and weaker third parties. And we're so used to what we see right now that we have a hard time imagining other realities. But parties, I mean, they do come and go, or they do change so much internally that they become something else. So likely, perhaps not. Possible, sure. And just to track back very quickly to something that Daryl Miller's comments made me think about, it's important to keep in mind that these claims of election fraud that had currency or have currency within a certain subset of the population are really tied to people's shock and dismay that efforts to disfranchise African Americans and other people of color didn't work as effectively as they have in the past. So the rage at the fraud is actually an indignation of voting working more the way that it's supposed to. And historically, attempts to disfranchise have been backed up with violence, political violence, usually directed at the group trying to participate. The departure here, the departure last week, is that the political violence was directed at the government itself.
Sure, thank you very much. Professor Miller, do you have anything to weigh in on there? Okay, no, well, that's fine. And, we have reached time, so I think we will call it there. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, Adrian Lent-Smith, Daryl Miller, and Alexander Kirshner, for sharing your perspectives. We're holding regular briefings on the transition of power, the pandemic, which, of course, is still going on, and other issues. If you'd like to be on the list for future briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu to let us know. In the meantime, please stay well, wear a mask, and be kind, because to echo Professor Miller's conjuring of Yeats earlier, you tread softly.